You can eat protein every day after 65 and still slowly lose muscle. That sounds impossible, but it's one of the most important changes that can happen inside an aging body. Because the problem isn't always that you're eating too little protein. Sometimes, the problem is that your muscles don't respond to protein the way they once did, and that changes the meaning of something as ordinary as breakfast. Think about what happens when you get out of bed in the morning. You walk to the kitchen, you climb a few stairs, you pick up a cup, you carry a grocery bag. These movements feel ordinary, but every one of them depends on muscle tissue that your body is constantly breaking down and rebuilding. When you're younger, the body is generally more responsive to the signals that tell muscle to repair and maintain itself. As you age, that response can become weaker. Scientists call this anabolic resistance. In simple terms, aging muscle may require a stronger nutritional and physical signal to produce the same response it once produced more easily. And now the egg becomes interesting, not because an egg is a miracle food, but because it provides a convenient source of high-quality protein and all 9 essential amino acids. So what happens when that protein reaches an older person's muscles? Does it trigger the same rebuilding response it would have triggered decades earlier? Does eating it first thing in the morning make a meaningful difference? Or is the real benefit simply that the egg helps increase the amount of protein consumed across the day? That's where the story becomes much more complicated, because there is something the headlines often leave out. Research does not show that eating eggs every morning automatically prevents muscle loss. It doesn't show that eggs can stop aging. And it doesn't prove that eating protein at breakfast is uniquely powerful for everyone. In fact, research on protein timing and distribution is mixed. Some findings make the idea biologically interesting. Other controlled research has not found a clear advantage from simply changing when protein is eaten. And studies examining eggs and long-term health have also produced different results. So we're not looking for a miracle. We're looking for something much more interesting. What does the evidence actually show about eggs, protein, and aging muscle? Because after 65, muscle isn't just about appearance. It helps determine whether ordinary movements remain ordinary. Standing up from a chair, walking upstairs, carrying groceries, maintaining balance, moving through the day without needing help for tasks that once required no thought at all. And that is why the question behind this video isn't really, are eggs good for you? It's this. When aging muscle becomes less responsive to protein, could a simple protein-rich breakfast become one small part of the system that helps maintain it? To answer that, we have to go inside the muscle itself. Because the most surprising part of this story doesn't begin with the egg. It begins with what aging does to your muscles. The first thing to understand is that your muscles are never truly off. Even while you're sitting still, muscle tissue is being broken down and rebuilt. It's a continuous process. Some proteins are being broken down, others are being created, and your body is constantly adjusting the balance between the two. When you're younger, this system is generally more responsive. You eat a meal containing protein, your digestive system breaks that protein down into amino acids. Those amino acids enter the bloodstream, and your muscles can use them as part of the process of maintaining and repairing tissue. But then something begins to change with age. The same protein signal may not produce the same response. This is where anabolic resistance becomes important. Think of your muscles as a construction site. Protein supplies the raw materials, but the construction site also has to respond to those materials. When you're younger, a relatively modest nutritional signal can stimulate muscle protein synthesis effectively. With aging, that response can become weaker. The protein is still being digested. The amino acids are still entering the bloodstream, but the muscle may not respond as strongly, and this creates a problem that can develop quietly. You don't suddenly wake up one morning with dramatically less muscle. Instead, small differences can accumulate. Little less muscle is maintained. A little less strength is available. Little more effort is required for ordinary movements. And over years, those small changes can become noticeable. But there's another important point. Anabolic resistance doesn't mean that older muscle becomes incapable of responding to protein. It means the response can be reduced, and that distinction matters because it means aging muscle is still biologically active. It is still responding to nutrition. It is still responding to movement, and it is still capable of adaptation. The question is, what kind of signals it receives. Protein is one of those signals, but it isn't the only one. Resistance exercise is another. Physical activity provides mechanical signals to muscle tissue. Nutrition provides amino acids and energy. And overall health influences how effectively the body can maintain this system. That's why muscle aging can't be explained by protein alone. Illness can affect muscle. Inflammation can affect muscle. Inactivity can affect muscle. Energy intake can affect muscle. Energy intake can affect muscle. Chronic disease can affect muscle, and factors such as age and sex can influence the response as well. So when someone says, just eat more protein, they are describing only one part of a much larger biological process. But protein still matter, and one amino acid has attracted particular attention in research on muscle protein synthesis: leucine. Leucine is one of the essential amino acids found in protein-containing foods. Your body cannot produce enough of it on its own, so it has to come from the diet. When protein is digested, leucine becomes available along with other amino acids. These amino acids participate in biological pathways involved in muscle protein synthesis. This is one reason researchers pay attention to the quality and composition of protein, not simply whether a food contains protein. And now the egg becomes more interesting again. Because eggs provide high-quality protein and all 9 essential amino acids, but there's still a major question. If the muscle's response to protein changes with age, does the amount and type of protein in one ordinary breakfast actually make a measurable difference? And even more importantly, could the timing of that protein change the response? That question sounds simple, but once researchers started studying it, the answer became much less obvious, because the human body doesn't operate according to a simple breakfast clock. And the next part of the story is where one of the most popular claims about eggs after 65 begins to fall apart. Is morning really the special time for protein, or is something else more? So, if protein is the real issue, why are we talking about eggs? Why not chicken? Why not fish? Why not yogurt? Why not another protein-rich food? That's exactly the question you should be asking, because the surprising thing about eggs isn't that they contain some secret ingredient that stops aging. They don't. Their advantage is much simpler. They're an easy way to get high-quality protein into your diet, and after 65, that simplicity can matter more than you might think. An egg contains protein with all 9 essential amino acids your body needs to obtain from food. Those amino acids become available after digestion and can be used for many different jobs throughout your body. And for your muscles, protein provides the raw material needed to maintain and repair tissue. But here's where things get interesting. You don't need a laboratory. You don't need a complicated meal plan. And you don't need to spend a fortune on supplements. You can put a few eggs on a plate in a matter of minutes. That makes eggs unusually practical. They're familiar, they're easy to prepare, they're relatively inexpensive. And for someone who struggles to eat enough protein, convenience can be a real advantage. But there's a trap here, because once you hear that eggs provide high-quality protein, it's tempting to jump to a much bigger conclusion. Then, eggs must be especially good for longevity. Not necessarily. And this distinction is extremely important. A food can be nutritious without being a longevity drug. It can support a healthy diet without independently extending your lifespan. And that's exactly why researchers have to look beyond the egg itself. They have to ask, what else is on the plate? Imagine one breakfast. 2 eggs. Vegetables. A piece of whole grain toast, maybe some fruit. Now imagine another breakfast. 2 eggs. Bacon. Sausage. Butter. Refined bread. 2 eggs. Technically, both breakfasts contain eggs, but nutritionally, they are very different meals. Your research highlights this exact problem. Eggs can be part of a potentially favorable pattern when combined with foods such as vegetables, fruit, oats, beans, or whole grains. But the same eggs can appear in a much less favorable pattern when routinely paired with processed meats, butter, and refined bread. So when you hear that people who eat eggs may have better health outcomes, you can't automatically assume the egg caused the difference. Maybe the people eating those eggs were also eating better meals. Maybe they were more physically active. Maybe they were replacing a sugary or refined breakfast with something more filling and protein-rich. Maybe their overall diet was simply better. This is one of the biggest mistakes people make when they hear nutrition research. They see one food associated with a health outcome and assume the food itself created the outcome. But human beings don't eat individual nutrients in isolation. We eat meals. We eat diets. We live lifestyles. And all of those things interact. That's why the egg becomes much more interesting when you stop asking, is the egg a superfood? And start asking, what happens when an older adult uses eggs to improve the quality of their breakfast? Now we're getting somewhere. Because if someone starts the morning with almost no protein, adding eggs could help them move closer to an adequate protein intake. And that could matter for aging muscle. But there's still one major question left. Does it actually matter that you eat that protein in the morning? This is where the story becomes much more controversial, because you've probably heard that breakfast is the most important time of day to feed your muscles. You've probably heard that your body is especially ready for protein after a night's sleep. You've probably even heard that eating protein at breakfast is dramatically better than eating it later. But when researchers actually test this idea, the answer becomes much less simple. And that's where we're going next. You've probably heard this advice before. Eat more protein at breakfast. Some people even take it a step further and say that the morning is the most important time of day to feed your muscles. The explanation sounds convincing. You've just spent the night asleep. You haven't eaten for several hours. Your body has been without protein. So the argument goes, your muscles wake up hungry for amino acids. Give them eggs first thing in the morning, and you supposedly create a powerful rebuilding signal. It sounds almost too perfect. But here's the problem. The science isn't that simple. And this is where we need to separate what sounds biologically reasonable from what research has actually demonstrated. Yes, your body needs protein. Yes, older muscles can become less responsive to protein. And yes, eating a protein-rich breakfast can be a useful way to increase the amount of protein you consume during the day. But does protein automatically work better simply because the clock says morning? That's a different question, and researchers have been trying to answer it. Some studies suggest that changing how protein is distributed across meals could potentially influence muscle-related outcomes. But other controlled research has found that changing protein distribution across the day did not significantly change muscle protein synthesis under the conditions being studied. In other words, there is no simple rule that says morning protein is always better than evening protein. And that matters because it's easy to turn a reasonable idea into a misleading health promise. Your muscles don't have a tiny alarm clock that rings at 7 a.m. and suddenly tells them, now is the only time you can use protein. Your body is far more flexible than that. What may matter much more is whether you're getting enough protein overall. Think about someone who normally eats very little protein at breakfast, coffee, toast, maybe cereal. Then lunch comes. Still not much protein. Dinner arrives and suddenly there's a large serving of chicken or fish. They may technically be eating protein, but they're getting most of it in one meal. Now imagine another person who spreads meaningful amounts of protein across breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The second pattern may simply make it easier to consistently meet their body's protein needs, and that is an important distinction. Breakfast may matter because of what it helps you achieve across the entire day, not necessarily because morning itself is magical. This changes the way we should think about eggs. Instead of saying, you must eat eggs every morning because your muscles are most responsive at breakfast, a more evidence-based message is, if breakfast is currently low in protein, adding a high-quality protein source such as eggs may help you improve your overall protein intake. That's a much less dramatic statement, but it's also much more useful because it gives you something you can actually control. You don't have to obsess over a perfect protein window. You don't have to believe that eating eggs at 7 a.m. will somehow cancel out the effects of aging. And you don't have to panic if you eat your protein at lunch instead. What matters is the bigger pattern. How much protein are you getting? Where is it coming from? Are you eating enough overall? Are you staying physically active? And perhaps most importantly, are you eating enough overall? Are you staying physically active? And perhaps most importantly, are you giving your medith unikil? Because protein and movement work together. If you eat a protein-rich breakfast but spend the rest of the day completely inactive, the story doesn't end there. Your muscles respond to mechanical demand. Resistance exercise provides that demand. Protein provides the raw materials. Your overall diet provides the energy and nutrients needed to support the process. That's why the strongest strategy isn't one magic food or one perfect meal. It's a combination of habits that reinforce one another. And this brings us to something even more surprising. Because if morning protein isn't necessarily magical, then why do some studies find that people who eat eggs regularly appear to have better health outcomes? Is there something special about the egg, or could something else be hiding behind the numbers? Because when researchers look at large groups of people, they sometimes find an interesting connection between egg consumption and health. But there's a problem. A connection doesn't automatically mean one thing caused the other. And once you understand that, the entire egg and longevity story starts to look very different. Now imagine 2 mornings. The first morning starts the way many people eat without thinking about it. A cup of coffee, a couple pieces of toast, maybe some jam, perhaps a bowl of cereal. It doesn't necessarily look unhealthy, but there's one thing missing: a meaningful amount of protein. Now imagine a different morning. 2 eggs, some vegetables, a piece of whole grain toast, maybe a little fruit on the side. Suddenly, the breakfast looks different. Not because eggs have transformed into some magical anti-aging food, but because you've changed the nutritional structure of the meal. You've added a convenient source of high-quality protein, and that small change can become important when repeated consistently. Remember what we discovered earlier. As you age, your muscles can become less responsive to the signals created by protein. That means maintaining an adequate protein intake becomes increasingly important. But there's a problem many older adults face. They simply don't eat much protein early in the day. Breakfast can be surprisingly low in protein. And if lunch is also light, you may arrive at dinner having consumed very little protein. Then dinner becomes the biggest protein meal of the entire day. That's not automatically wrong, but it can make it harder for some people to consistently meet their nutritional needs. This is where eggs become useful. They give you a simple way to add protein without completely redesigning your diet. And that may be the real value. Not that eggs are uniquely powerful, but that they're easy. Easy foods are more likely to become consistent habits, and consistency matters. One protein-rich breakfast doesn't rebuild years of lost muscle. One morning of eating eggs won't suddenly make your legs stronger. One meal doesn't reverse aging. But imagine making a better breakfast part of your routine for months and years. Now you're no longer talking about one egg. You're talking about a repeated behavior. And repeated behaviors can shape your overall diet. But there's another detail that's easy to overlook. When you add something to your diet, you're also changing what you're not eating. That's why researchers have to think about food substitution. Suppose you add eggs to your breakfast. What did they replace? Did they replace a sugary cereal, a pastry, a highly refined breakfast? Or did you simply add eggs on top of an already adequate meal? Those situations are completely different. If eggs replace a low-protein, highly refined breakfast with a more balanced meal containing protein, vegetables, whole grains, or fruit, the overall nutritional pattern may improve. But if eggs are added to a breakfast already high in saturated fat and processed meat, the picture becomes very different. This is why looking at one food in isolation can be misleading. Your body doesn't receive an isolated label saying egg. It receives nutrients, calories, protein, fat, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals, and all of these arrive as part of a larger dietary pattern. So when you hear someone say, people who eat eggs are healthier, the next question should always be, compared with what? That one question can completely change how you interpret nutrition research. Because maybe the people eating eggs weren't healthier because of the eggs. Maybe they were healthier because the eggs replaced something else. Maybe they were more likely to eat a balanced breakfast. Maybe they were simply consuming enough protein throughout the day. Or maybe there was no meaningful effect at all. And this is exactly why observational nutrition studies can be so difficult to interpret. Researchers can find patterns, but patterns don't always reveal causes. And now we're about to look at some of those patterns. Because when researchers examined egg consumption and health outcomes in older adults, they found something fascinating. Some studies suggested a possible benefit. Others found no meaningful association. And that contradiction raises the biggest question of this entire story. If eggs really help people live healthier lives, why doesn't every study show the same thing? So now we have a problem. Some research appears to suggest that people who regularly eat eggs may have better health outcomes. But other research doesn't find the same thing. And if you're watching this expecting a simple answer, this is where the story gets interesting. Because the difference isn't necessarily about who is right. It may be about what the studies are actually measuring. Let's start with a large analysis involving more than 37,000 adults. Researchers looked at egg consumption and health outcomes. And what they found was not the dramatic result you might expect. An additional half an egg per day was not significantly associated with all-cause mortality or death from cardiovascular disease. In other words, the data did not show that simply eating more eggs automatically translated into a longer life. That's important, because it means we can't honestly tell you eat eggs every morning and you'll live longer. The evidence doesn't support that promise. But then, something else happened. Another study involving older adults found that people who consumed eggs up to several times per week had a lower risk of mortality compared with certain comparison groups. And an analysis connected with the ASPRE research also reported an association between regular egg consumption and a lower risk of cardiovascular disease death. At first glance, that sounds like proof. Eggs look good, older adults who eat them appear to have better outcomes. So why not simply conclude that eggs are protective? Because there is a huge difference between saying people who eat eggs tend to have this outcome and saying eggs cause this outcome. Those are not the same statement. Imagine you discover that people who carry umbrellas are more likely to arrive at work late. You could look at thousands of people and find the association. Umbrella carriers arrive late more often. But the umbrella didn't make them late. Rain did. The umbrella was simply something people carried because it was raining. Nutrition research can have the same problem. People who eat eggs may differ from people who don't eat eggs in many other ways. Maybe they exercise more. Maybe they eat more vegetables. Maybe they consume more protein overall. Maybe they have different breakfast habits. Maybe they smoke less. Maybe they have better access to health care. Maybe they follow other healthy habits that researchers cannot perfectly account for. So the egg could be part of a healthy lifestyle without being the primary cause of the health outcome. This is called confounding. And it is one of the reasons observational nutrition research needs to be interpreted carefully. Now, this doesn't mean those studies are useless. Far from it. They can reveal patterns that researchers need to investigate. They can generate important questions. They can tell scientists something interesting might be happening here, but they cannot always tell us exactly why it is happening, and that's why the different egg studies are so important. One study may find no meaningful relationship, another may find an association, and instead of forcing these studies into a single dramatic conclusion, we should ask what the total body of evidence actually allows us to say. Right now, the safest conclusion is much more modest. Eggs can be part of a healthy diet. They can provide high-quality protein. They can make it easier to build a protein-containing breakfast. And for someone who isn't getting enough protein, they may be a practical choice. But there is no strong evidence that eggs themselves are a magic longevity food. And that distinction protects you from one of the biggest traps in online health advice. Because once a food becomes popular, the story tends to grow. First, someone says eggs contain protein. Then someone says protein helps muscle. Then the story becomes eggs preserve muscle. Then eggs prevent aging. And eventually, eggs could add decades to your life. Each step sounds like a small exaggeration. But by the end, the original evidence has almost disappeared. The reality is much more interesting. Eggs may be useful. Protein is important. Muscle preservation matters. But your health is determined by an entire system of habits, not one food. And there's one major issue we haven't addressed yet. What about cholesterol? Because for decades, many people were told to be afraid of eggs for exactly that reason. So if you're over 65 and thinking about making eggs a regular part of breakfast, there's one question you probably want answered. Are eggs actually a problem for your heart? And the answer depends on something most people don't consider when they look at an egg sitting on a plate. For decades, eggs were placed in a category that made many people nervous: cholesterol. You may have heard it for years. Don't eat too many eggs. Eggs are bad for your heart. Egg yolks contain cholesterol, so you should avoid them. And if you've been hearing those warnings since you were younger, it's understandable if you still hesitate before putting eggs on your breakfast plate. But there's an important distinction that often gets lost. The cholesterol inside a food is not exactly the same thing as the cholesterol circulating in your blood. Your body regulates cholesterol in complicated ways, and the effect of a particular food can't always be predicted simply by looking at how much cholesterol that food contains. This is one reason modern nutrition advice has increasingly shifted toward looking at the entire dietary pattern. What are you eating? What are you eating with it? How much saturated fat is in the overall diet? What foods are being replaced? And what does your individual health profile look like? Because consider two breakfasts again. The first is eggs with vegetables, fruit, and whole grains. The second is eggs cooked in lots of butter, served alongside bacon, sausage, and refined bread. Both contain eggs, but they are not the same dietary pattern. The food surrounding the egg can completely change the nutritional picture, and this is where the conversation becomes much more useful. Instead of asking, are eggs good or bad? Ask, how do eggs fit into my overall diet? That question gives you much more information. For someone who uses eggs as a convenient source of protein while eating plenty of vegetables, fruit, whole grains, beans, and other nutrient-dense foods, the context is very different from someone whose breakfast regularly includes large amounts of processed meat and saturated fat. And there's another point that matters after 65. Your nutritional needs don't exist in isolation from your medical history. Some people may be able to include eggs regularly without much concern. Others may have health conditions or dietary restrictions that require a more individualized approach. If you have been told that you have high LDL cholesterol, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, kidney disease, or another condition that affects your diet, your best choice may not be the same as someone else's. That's why a universal rule like, everyone over 65 should eat eggs every morning, is too simplistic. The goal isn't to create another food rule. The goal is to understand what your body needs and how a particular food fits into that picture. And this brings us back to the original question. If eggs aren't a miracle food, if eating them in the morning isn't proven to be uniquely powerful, and if the effect depends partly on what else you're eating, then why should you care about eggs at all? Because the answer may have very little to do with cholesterol. It may have much more to do with something you can actually feel every day. Strength. Think about the things you want to keep doing as you get older. Getting up from the floor, walking upstairs, carrying groceries, opening a heavy door, getting out of a chair without pushing yourself up with your arms, taking a long walk without worrying about whether your legs will give out. These abilities depend heavily on your muscles. And that's why the conversation shouldn't end with, "Are eggs good for your heart?" There's a bigger question. Are your daily habits helping you preserve the muscle that gives you independence? Because if your goal isn't simply to live longer, but to remain capable, mobile, and independent for as long as possible, then the egg is only one small piece of the puzzle. And the next piece may be far more important than breakfast itself, movement. Because protein gives your body raw materials. But your muscles also need a reason to use them. So if eggs aren't the whole answer, what is? If you're over 65 and you want to stay strong, mobile, and independent, there are a few things your muscles need far more than a single superfood. And the first one may surprise you. Your muscles need a reason to stay. Think about what happens when you stop using a muscle. If your arm is placed in a cast for several weeks, the muscle becomes smaller. If someone spends a long period in bed, their strength can decline surprisingly quickly. Your body is constantly adapting to what you ask it to do, and your muscles are no different. If you regularly challenge them, your body has a reason to maintain them. If you rarely challenge them, maintaining all that muscle becomes less of a priority. This is why resistance exercise becomes so important as you age. You don't necessarily need a complicated gym routine. The important idea is to give your muscles some form of resistance that challenges them. It could involve weights, resistance bands, body weight movements, or exercises recommended by a qualified professional based on your abilities. The goal is simple. Give your muscles a reason to remain strong. And then comes the second piece, protein. Exercise tells your body that the muscle is needed. Protein provides amino acids that can support the repair and maintenance of that tissue. That's why these two things work together. Imagine telling your body, "I'm going to use these muscles." That's the exercise signal. Then you provide the nutrients needed to support the work. That's where protein comes in. But there's another piece people often overlook. You need enough food overall. If you're consistently undereating, your body has fewer resources available to support all of its functions. This doesn't mean you should simply eat as much as possible. It means that nutrition is bigger than one nutrient. Protein matters, but so do overall calories, vitamins, minerals, healthy fats, carbohydrates, fiber, hydration, and the quality of your overall diet. And then there's something you can't simply fix with food: your health, illness, inflammation, inactivity, chronic disease, kidney problems, certain medications, poor recovery. All of these can influence how well your body maintains muscle. That's why two people can eat the exact same breakfast and experience very different results. One person may be active and healthy. Another may be recovering from an illness. Another may have a medical condition that affects nutrition or muscle. There is no single breakfast that overrides all of those factors. And this is where the egg finally finds its proper place. Not at the top of the pyramid. Not as a miracle, but as one practical tool. If eating eggs helps you consistently get enough high-quality protein, And if you're also giving your muscles a reason to stay strong through resistance exercise, and if you're eating enough overall, and if your broader diet supports your health, then eggs can fit very naturally into that strategy. But remove the other pieces, and the eggs becomes much less impressive. You can't eat eggs and expect them to replace strength training. You can't eat eggs and expect them to reverse years of inactivity. You can't eat eggs and expect them to overcome a poor overall diet. And you certainly can't expect them to stop the biological process of aging. But here's the hopeful part. You don't need one food to do all of those things. You just need several small habits that work together. A protein-rich breakfast, regular resistance exercise, enough food and nutrients, adequate recovery, and a diet built around foods that support your overall health. That's a much more realistic strategy, and perhaps a much more powerful one. Because the goal isn't to find a food that makes you younger. The goal is to protect the abilities that make your later years worth living. The ability to stand up without struggling. The ability to carry your own groceries. The ability to climb the stairs. The ability to travel. The ability to carry your own groceries. The ability to climb the stairs. The ability to get down on the floor and back up again. The ability to live your life without constantly asking someone else for help. That is what muscle gives you. Independence. And now we can finally return to the question that started this entire investigation. If you're over 65, should you actually eat eggs every morning? The answer is more nuanced than yes or no. And the final piece may help you decide what makes sense for your own breakfast. After following the evidence this far, we can finally return to the question that started the entire investigation. What does eating eggs every morning actually mean for someone over 65? The answer is more complicated than the headlines suggest. There is no strong evidence showing that every person over 65 will benefit from eating eggs every morning. There is also no evidence that eggs by themselves can prevent age-related muscle loss or dramatically extend lifespan. What the research does show is more specific. Eggs provide high-quality protein. They contain all 9 essential amino acids, and they can contribute to the total amount of protein consumed during the day. That matters because aging muscle can become less responsive to protein. But the relationship doesn't stop there. The amount of protein consumed is only one part of the picture. The body's response is also influenced by physical activity, resistance exercise, total energy intake, illness, inflammation, chronic disease, and other factors. So an egg can provide protein. But what happens to that protein inside the body depends on the condition of the entire system. This is why the idea of a single food controlling muscle aging is misleading. The same thing applies to breakfast timing. There is a fascinating theory that protein consumed in the morning may provide older muscles with a particularly useful signal after the overnight fasting period. But controlled research has not established a simple rule that protein is always more effective when consumed in the morning. Evidence on protein distribution throughout the day remains mixed. That means the phrase, "eat eggs every morning for stronger muscles," goes further than the evidence allows. More accurate interpretation is much less dramatic. For someone whose breakfast contains very little protein, eggs can be one convenient way of increasing protein intake. But whether that produces a meaningful long-term difference depends on the person's entire diet and lifestyle. And this is where the idea of replacement becomes important. Suppose eggs replace a breakfast that provides very little protein. The nutritional effect may be different from simply adding eggs to an already balanced meal. And suppose those eggs are eaten with vegetables, fruit, whole grains, or other nutrient-dense foods. That is a different dietary pattern from eggs regularly accompanied by processed meats, refined carbohydrates, and large amounts of saturated fat. So when scientists study egg consumption, they are dealing with a complicated question. They are not simply studying an egg. They are studying people. And people eat many different foods. They exercise differently. They have different medical histories. They have different levels of physical activity. They have different nutritional needs. All of those variables can influence health outcomes. This is why the research surrounding eggs and longevity remains difficult to interpret. Some studies have reported favorable associations. Others have found no significant relationship between additional egg consumption and mortality. Neither result automatically proves what caused the outcome. And that leaves us with a much more interesting conclusion. Eggs appear to be a useful source of high-quality protein. They can fit into a healthy dietary pattern. They may help increase protein intake when a meal is otherwise low in protein. But the evidence does not support turning them into a universal anti-aging prescription. The egg is simply one part of a much larger biological story, and that story brings us back to the thing that matters most in this entire discussion: muscle. Because the reason researchers care about protein after 65 isn't really about eggs. It's about what happens when the body gradually becomes less capable of maintaining the muscle that supports movement and independence. And that leads to the final question. If eggs aren't a miracle food, if breakfast timing isn't proven to be magical, and if longevity studies remain mixed, why does muscle preservation matter so much in the first place? The answer to that final question takes us beyond breakfast. Because the most important discovery in this investigation isn't that eggs are powerful. It's that muscle is powerful. Muscle allows the body to produce movement. It supports everyday physical function. It contributes to balance, mobility, and the ability to perform ordinary tasks. And as people age, maintaining that physical capacity becomes increasingly important. This is why scientists study protein, exercise, nutrition, and aging together. They are not isolated subjects. They are connected parts of the same biological system. Protein provides amino acids. Muscle activity creates a reason for the tissue to adapt and remain functional. Adequate nutrition provides the energy and nutrients required for normal biological processes, and overall health can influence how effectively the body responds. Eggs fit into this picture because they provide protein. That's their scientifically interesting role, not because they contain a secret substance that stops aging, not because eating them at breakfast guarantees stronger muscles, and not because they have been proven to add decades to human life. The more accurate story is much simpler. As the body ages, muscle becomes more difficult to maintain. The response to protein can become less efficient. Physical inactivity can accelerate muscle loss, and nutritional adequacy becomes increasingly important. At the same time, research continues to examine how protein amount, protein quality, meal distribution, physical activity, and overall diet interact. That is why a single food cannot explain healthy aging. And it is also why nutrition headlines can sometimes be misleading. A study finds that people who eat eggs have a particular health outcome. The headline becomes, "Eggs protect your heart." Another study examines protein and muscle. The headline becomes, "Eggs build muscle after 65." Another study observes an association with mortality. The headline becomes, "Eggs help you live longer." But the original research is usually much more cautious. It may show an association. It may identify a possible mechanism. It may suggest a relationship that needs further investigation. And sometimes different studies produce different results. That's not necessarily a failure of science. It's what happens when researchers investigate something as complicated as human nutrition. There is no single variable called healthy aging. There are thousands of interacting factors: genes, physical activity, diet, sleep, disease, medications, body composition, social environment, and countless other influences. So the surprising effect of eggs after 65 isn't that they possess some extraordinary power. The surprising effect of eggs after 65 isn't that they possess some extraordinary power. The surprising effect is what happens eating. Protein can contribute to the maintenance of muscle. Muscle contributes to physical function, and physical function contributes to independence. But every step in that chain depends on more than one factor. That is the real lesson. The question was never simply, are eggs good? The better scientific question is, how do eggs, protein, diet, physical activity, and aging interact inside the human body? And that question is still being studied. What we know is that eggs provide high-quality protein. What we know is that aging changes the way muscle responds to nutritional signals. What we know is that muscle preservation depends on multiple factors, and what remains uncertain is exactly how much benefit comes specifically from eating eggs, particularly when compared with other protein sources and different dietary patterns. So after 65, the egg isn't a miracle. It isn't a villain either. It's simply a food. A food that happens to contain a useful amount of high-quality protein. And perhaps that's what makes the story so interesting. Because sometimes the most important discoveries aren't about finding a magical ingredient. They're about understanding how ordinary foods interact with an extraordinary system, the aging human body. And when it comes to healthy aging, the most important story may not be about adding decades to life. It may be about understanding the biology that helps preserve the ability to live those years with strength, mobility, and independence.